Hello, Yu-Gi-Oh players, and welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! Business Casual. I am your host, the RJB0. So, today I will be talking to you guys about how anybody playing any deck can beat Bujins. Now, this is the beginning of a longer series of videos about cards that can take down the January 2014 and beyond format. And how basically this format is unique to a lot of others in the past in that there is basically a side deck card that every deck can run against each and every deck in this current meta. And I am starting with Bujins, partially because a lot of people struggle against Bujins, kind of the same way that people struggled against Dino Rabbit, and that it creates this huge freak out factor. Also, ignore the Mecha Fan of Beast deck up here. Anyway, it keeps players really out of their calmest mind, which it means that people are less likely to play well if they are freaking out because they don't know how to play against Bujins. And in all reality, it's very easy to beat Bujins if you know what to side against them and if you know what cards work for them. So I am going to just go down this list, and I'm going to try and be brief and give you guys a full extent of cards that basically any deck can run. I mean, not every deck can run each and every one of these cards, but every deck has a set of these cards that they could potentially play in order to beat Bujin. So let's start with DNA Surgery. DNA Surgery and Light Imprisoning Mirror are probably the most popular current cards going against Bujins. Because they directly go after the plays that Bujins make. Light Imprisoning Mirror stops the Bujin monsters on the field and the Bujin monsters in the graveyard. DNA Surgery stops everything except the Bujin monster on the field. DNA Surgery, you can change the type of all monsters on the board, which means that you can change it away from Beast Warriors, which means that Crane, Hare, Centipede, Quillen, all those cards are non-functional as long as DNA Surgery is calling a type other than Beast Warrior. One of the things that I've been discussing with people about doing with DNA Surgery that could even further abuse it against Bujins is if you're playing a deck that puts a lot of level 4s on the board, that can consistently get rank 4s on the board, what you can do is you can activate DNA Surgery, go for your rank 4 play by calling Dinosaur, and be able to put Evilzar Logia or Evilzar Dolka, probably Logia, on the board. Because if you put the Logia on the board with a DNA Surgery behind it, your opponent is going to have to burn through your Logia before they can successfully MST your DNA Surgery, which means that chances are they're going to, like, even if they tried to MST, you could hit that Logia button, and they would have to search for another way to get rid of DNA Surgery. Meanwhile, they still can't use their Bujin's effects, at which point you can go into another Logia or into a Dolka. So DNA Surgery is a very, very powerful card this format, and it's usable against Beast Warriors as well and Spellbook. So if you're one of those decks, particularly Beast Warriors based decks, DNA Surgery may not be the card for you. But there are other options. For instance, the Banishers. The first thing that we have to discuss about Banishers is always which Banisher is better. I think, in my personal opinion, this format, Banisher of the Light, is better. The reason is because if you're going to be playing it against Bujins, Banisher of the Radiance is not going to stay on the board very long. Why? Because it's weaker than Yamato and Mikazuchi. So if it's weaker than Yamato and Mikazuchi, I think it's got the same attack points as Arasuda. Anyway, then it's not going to survive on the board for very long, which means it's not going to put in work. If you have Banisher of the Light, it takes a Mikazuchi or a Yamato with multiple tankies on the board in order to get rid of the darn thing, because he can't crane over it, and if you can't put a Quillen in the graveyard, then you can't just pop it right off the bat. The disadvantage of using Banisher of the Light is that it uses up a normal summon, which is kind of an issue for a lot of decks, but not all of them. You do have, as an alternative, you have Macro and D Fissure. So these cards don't use up your normal summon, however they do have the disadvantage of being weak to MST, like all other continuous spell and trap cards, which tend to make up the majority of the side deck. So you can use Macrocosmos and D Fissure, and that doesn't take up your normal summon. The advantage of Macro and D Fissure is they are useful mid to late game. as opposed to the Banishers, which you really have to hit early on in the game in order for them to make a difference against Bujins. The thing about D Fissure and Macro is even if you hit them mid-game, you can still use them to stop your opponent's cranes. Now, there's a little bit of playing theory around playing D Fissure or Macrocosmos that you have to be conscious of when you're playing against Bujins. When you're playing against a deck, you want to remove as many options from your opponent as possible. So in order to ensure that your play goes through with a D Fissure or Macrocosmos, what you want to do is you want to keep that D Fissure Macrocosmos hidden, so that when you're making your plays for the monster that can run over the Bujins, the Yamato, the Mikazuchis, you want to make sure that your opponent doesn't know that you have that, because if they do know that you have that, they have Bottomless, they have Torrential, they have Warning, they have Compulsory, etc., etc., etc. But if you don't let them know you have that until after you've summoned your monster, you can hit the D Fissure button, and then the only options they have left to them are things that can be used during the battle phase. The D Prisons, I suppose Compulsory works during that time too, the Mirror Forces, etc. So that's a little bit of theory that you want to keep conscious of. Once again, these cards are vulnerable to MST, and once again, they also aren't for every deck. There are a lot of decks, this format included, that need their graveyard in order to function properly. For those, we have things like Soul Drain. Soul Drain allows you to keep a graveyard without either player being able to use monster effects in the graveyard. Soul Drain is good for beating the graveyard monsters that Bujins have, which means that it's more effective for control decks, for decks that are more likely to take down the Mikazuchi or Yamato via card effect, that they're going to try and pop it before they run into it. This is good for things like TG Stun, for things like, what's it called, Fire Fist. Soul Drain is very effective against Bujins. Another card that's similarly effective, that also works for decks like Mermails, and other decks that need their effects in the graveyard, is Imperial Iron Wall. Imperial Iron Wall stops both players from banishing from the graveyard, or banishing at all, but in this case it's more important to keep your opponent from banishing from the graveyard. Which means that you can still use your graveyard effects, but Bujin monsters can't, because they have to banish themselves from the graveyard in order to activate. If you really can't afford either of them, there's always Abyss Dweller. Abyss Dweller only acts for your opponent, and you can choose when to activate it, and that allows you to keep up your field presence. If you can back up that Abyss Dweller, then you can keep your opponent from popping it, and you can keep your opponent from running into it with the Mikazuchi or the Yamato and craning it, etc., etc., etc. Abyss Dweller is very good. It's good for decks like Mermails. It's good for all those decks that require the ability to both banish and use effects in their graveyard, as long as you can put that Abyss Dweller on the board. Another option, especially for decks like Garden Bee and Spellbooks, is Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer. While Kaiku is on the board, your opponent can't banish cards from either player's graveyard, and you can choose to banish cards if it deals damage to your opponent, which are both very good against Bujins because you can keep them from using things like Quillen, etc., etc., etc. It keeps them from using those graveyard effects. It's especially good in Spellbooks because you can keep backing it up, and while it's on the board, you can also Fate Yamato and stuff like that. It's a very good backup play for Spellbooks. But the real problem with these cards is that they can't stop Crane. Crane is a major issue when you're playing against Bujins. So there are other cards that you can use. One of the most effective side deck cards against Bujins that's usable by absolutely every deck is Debunk. Debunk is a counter trap card that says if your opponent activates an effect or a monster effect in the graveyard or in the hand, you negate that effect and remove the monster from play. So if you attack into a Mikazuchi or a Yamato, and your opponent goes into damage calculation and drops that Crane, you can debunk that Crane, and then they can't do anything else from there. It's guaranteed that you're going to take out their monster, because it's during damage calculation, which means that they don't get another chain in order to activate their Crane in, or an Honest, and also Debunk is a counter trap card, which means that they can't chain to it. So it's usable in absolutely every deck. It isn't weak to MST like Mind Drain, which is another card that can stop Crane, but it's continuous, so it can continue stopping Cranes. But I think actually, in all reality, Debunk is your best choice. Debunk is an amazing card. It's usable by every deck, and it takes down Crane. Not to mention the fact that it can also beat the graveyard effect monsters, because it also negates the activation of cards that activate in the graveyard. So for a lot of decks, that's some combination of that and Abyss Dweller, Soul Drain, etc., will do the trick. But some decks won't be able to get into those cards as quickly, so there are some other backup strategies that you can use. One of them is stopping them from searching. Bujin is a very search-based archetype. They use the Yamato, they use the Tenki, they use Susanoo in order to keep adding cards from their deck to their hand, which means that if you can stop them via things like Mistake and via Ryo, then you're actually in pretty good shape. If you can put a Ryo on the board and protect it against Bujins, protect it from Crane with a Debunk or something of that sort, you can probably keep the advantage over over Bujins very effectively, just because they can't gain more resources from their deck, which is the thing that Yamato gives them major advantage through. Mistake can also do a similar thing by forcing them into a minus. They can't run it over like they can with Ryo, but once again, they can MST it. So it really depends on your deck's playstyle, which you would rather run. And in some cases, you could run both very effectively. One strategy that is often ignored for taking down Bujins is just removing their monsters from the field. Mataion and Grand Mole both do not target, which means that they are immune to Turtle, and if you can just attack into that Yamato, bounce that Yamato back, and then you can keep hitting them directly and keep dealing damage. So keeping their monsters off the board keeps them from making plays. If they don't have a monster on the board, they can't use Quillen, they can't use Crane, they can't do any of those things. And they only ever seem to summon one monster at a time, which means that if they're running that Kaiser Coliseum, Grand Mole or Mataion is actually a very effective strategy, because you can get rid of their monster, which takes away the jurisdiction of Kaiser Coliseum. So that is just the list of cards that I can think of off the top of my head. Some combination of each of these cards can go into almost every side deck imaginable and do relatively well. So I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, let me know why. And then, of course, subscribe for more decks discussion, analysis, and general Yu-Gi-Oh! Shenanigans. Meanwhile, thank you guys for watching Yu-Gi-Oh! and Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0, and I got a jet. See you guys.